In the desolate plains of West Texas, where civilization is just a distant memory and the stars shine brighter than anywhere else on Earth, a struggling cowboy named Jake Thompson was barely surviving on his failing ranch. One freezing November night, while chasing a spooked horse through the darkness, he witnessed something that would change not only his life, but the fate of all humanity. A brilliant streak of light tore across the sky, followed by a deafening crash that shook the ground beneath his boots. What he discovered in that smoking crater wasn't wreckage from a satellite or a fallen meteor. It was a ship, unlike anything human technology could produce, and inside it, crying softly, was a baby. Not a human baby, but something otherworldly, fragile, and utterly alone. Jake's decision to save that infant in that single moment of compassion set into motion a chain of events that would bring 1,000 alien ships to Earth, as doorstep demanding answers, threatening war, and forcing one ordinary man to stand between two worlds on the brink of collision. Jake Thompson had always considered himself unlucky. At 37 years old, he was barely keeping his family's ranch afloat. The land that had sustained 3 generations of Thompsons was now little more than dust and dead. His cattle numbered fewer each year. The water wells were running dry, and the bank had already sent 2 notices about the mortgage. He lived alone in the old farmhouse, the same one his grandfather had built with his own hands, and every creaking floorboard reminded him of everything he'd lost: his parents to illness, his brother to the city, and his dreams to the harsh reality of modern economics crushing small ranches like his. That particular November night was colder than usual. Jake had been mending fences all day, his hands raw and bleeding slightly through his worn work gloves. Around midnight, he was settling into his threadbare couch with a glass of cheap whiskey when he heard his horse, Dakota, screaming in terror from the stable. Jake grabbed his shotgun and flashlight and rushed outside, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Dakota was rearing violently, her eyes wide with primal fear, looking toward the eastern pasture. Then Jake saw a light in the sky, but not like any aircraft he'd ever seen. It was blue-white, pulsing with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, and it was descending fast, too fast, leaving a trail of what looked like burning atmosphere in its wake. The sound that followed was unlike anything in Jake's experience, not quite an explosion, but a deep, resonating boom that he felt in his chest and bones. The ground shook violently enough that he stumbled, and Dakota finally broke free from her stall, galloping wildly into the darkness. Jake stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Every instinct told him to stay away, to call the authorities, to let someone else deal with whatever had just crashed on his property. But curiosity and a lifetime of dealing with problems himself won out. He climbed into his old pickup truck and drove across the rutted pasture toward the impact site, following the pillar of smoke rising into the star-filled sky. The crater was about 50 yards wide and perhaps 20 feet deep at its center. The earth around it was scorched black, and the air shimmered with residual heat despite the freezing temperature. Jake approached cautiously, his shotgun ready, though he had no idea what good it would do against whatever could survive a crash like this. At the bottom of the crater, partially buried in the torn earth, was an object that made his mind rebel against what his eyes were seeing. The craft, because it clearly was a craft of some kind, was roughly triangular, about the size of his truck, and made of a material that seemed to shift colors in the firelight from deep purple to silver, to something his brain couldn't quite name. Parts of it were crumpled from the impact, and a strange luminescent fluid was leaking from cracks in its hull. There were no visible seams, no windows, no markings that looked like any language Jake had ever seen. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. He slid down into the crater, his boots slipping on the loose soil. As he got closer, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a sound he recognized instantly because it was universal across all creatures. The sound of an infant crying. It was muffled, coming from inside the craft. Jake circled the wreckage until he found what might have been a door, or what was left of one. Part of it had been torn away in the crash, leaving an opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, the craft was even more impossible than the outside. The walls glowed with a soft bioluminescence, and the air smelled like ozone and something sweet he couldn't identify. Strange symbols covered every surface, pulsing with light. In what appeared to be the center of the craft, held in some kind of pod or cradle that had partially broken open, was the baby. Jake approached slowly, his hands shaking. The infant was small, perhaps the size of a human newborn, but clearly not human. Its skin had a faint silvery sheen, and its eyes, when they opened to look at him, were enormous, completely black like pools of infinite depth. It had tiny fingers, more than 5 on each hand, and when it reached toward him, crying harder now, Jake felt something break open in his chest. This was a baby, alien or not, and it was terrified and alone. Without thinking about the consequences, Jake carefully lifted the infant from its broken cradle. It was surprisingly light, and it immediately stopped crying when he held it against his chest, as if sensing safety. The baby's skin was warm, and Jake could feel a rapid heartbeat or something like it. Wrapped around the infant was a blanket of sorts, made from the same color-shifting material as the ship, incredibly soft despite its apparent technological sophistication. As Jake turned to leave the craft, something caught his eye, a device of some kind, attached to the cradle, glowing with urgent red light. Before he could examine it, the entire craft shuddered violently, and sparks began cascading from the walls. Whatever structural integrity had survived, the crash was failing rapidly. Jake ran, clutching the baby tightly, as the ship's interior seemed to fold in on itself. He barely made it out before a brilliant white light erupted from the craft, forcing him to shield his eyes and run blindly up the crater's edge. By the time he reached his truck, the ship was nothing but a glowing mass of melting metal and evaporating technology, sinking deeper into the earth, as if dissolving into another dimension. Within minutes, there was nothing left but a scorched crater and the fading smell of ozone. If Jake hadn't had the baby wrapped in that strange blanket, still pressed against his chest, he might have convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing. Back at the farmhouse, Jake laid the baby on his kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light, really seeing it for the first time. The infant looked back at him with those bottomless black eyes, no longer crying, just watching with an intelligence that seemed far beyond any newborn. Jake had no idea what to do. Call the police? The government? What would they do with an alien baby? Take it away to some facility. Treat it like a specimen rather than a living being. The thought made him sick. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a coo, and one of its many-fingered hands wrapped around Jake's thumb. In that moment, despite every reasonable thought screaming at him about the insanity of the situation, Jake Thompson made a decision that would alter the course of human history. He would protect this child, at least until he understood more about what was happening. He had no idea that this decision had already been observed from very far away, and that in mere hours, the response would be unlike anything Earth had ever faced. Jake spent that entire first night in a daze, trying to care for a being he didn't understand. The baby seemed fragile yet remarkably resilient. It didn't cry much after those first moments in the farmhouse, but Jake could sense its needs through some inexplicable connection, when it was uncomfortable, when it needed warmth, when it was afraid. He fashioned a makeshift crib from a drawer lined with blankets and kept the infant close to the wood stove in his living room. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose, Jake studied the baby more carefully. In the morning light, he could see that its silvery skin had subtle patterns, like constellations, that seemed to shift and move. The infant's eyes, those impossibly dark pools, tracked his movements with unsettling awareness. Most disturbing and fascinating was that the baby seemed to be learning at an accelerated rate. By morning, it had figured out that Jake's face meant safety and would calm immediately when he leaned into view. Jake knew he couldn't keep this secret forever, but he also knew he needed time to think, to plan. He decided to keep the baby hidden in his house, at least for a few days, while he figured out the right course of action. He lived far enough from town that unexpected visitors were rare, and he could always claim he was sick if anyone came calling. He spent the morning trying to feed the baby, experimenting with different liquids, finally finding that it would accept warm water with a small amount of honey mixed in, which it drank eagerly from a bottle Jake fashioned from an old medicine dropper. Around mid-morning, Jake's phone rang, startling him so badly he nearly dropped the baby. It was his only neighbor, Martha Brennan, a widow who lived 5 miles down the road. "Jake, did you see that light last night? Looked like something crashed on your property. You all right?" Her voice was concerned but curious. Jake's mind raced. "Yeah, Martha, I saw it. Looked like maybe a meteor or some space junk. Left a pretty good crater in my east pasture, but I'm fine. Thanks for checking." There was a pause. "You call anyone about it? Might be dangerous, radiation or something." Jake assured her he'd look into it and ended the call as quickly as possible without seeming rude. But Martha's call made him realize something important. Other people had seen the crash. It was probably already being reported. He turned on his old television, flipping to a news station, and sure enough, there were reports of an unexplained aerial phenomenon over West Texas. Experts were being interviewed, speculating about satellites or meteor showers. Nobody was saying the word UFO yet, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in their voices. So far, no one had pinpointed his exact location, but it was only a matter of time. The baby Jake had started thinking of it as Zeke, though he had no idea if it even had a concept of names, was sleeping peacefully in the drawer crib when Jake heard the sound that would change everything. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible, like the vibration of a massive engine far in the distance. At first, Jake thought it might be his imagination, stress-induced hallucination from the previous night's events. But the hum grew louder, deeper, until it seemed to resonate through the ground itself, shaking dust from the rafters of his old house. Jake walked outside into his front yard, shielding his eyes against the bright November sun, and looked up at the sky. For a moment, he saw nothing but the usual endless blue expanse of West Texas sky. Then, like something emerging from behind a curtain, shapes began to appear. Not one or two, but hundreds, then thousands, materializing as if they'd been invisible until that moment. Ships, enormous vessels of varying sizes, from craft no bigger than cars to behemoths that must have been miles across, filled the sky from horizon to horizon. They hung there, motionless, silent except for that deep thrumming that Jake felt more than heard. Each ship had a different design, though all shared a similar aesthetic: organic curves, combined with geometric precision, surfaces that seemed to be made of light as much as matter. Some were surrounded by halos of energy. Others seemed to fade in and out of full visibility. The sheer scale was incomprehensible. Jake had seen photos of aircraft carrier groups at sea, had marveled at the images of massive cargo ships and oil tankers, but this was beyond anything human engineering had achieved. These ships made the largest human structures look like children's toys. Jake's legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the dirt of his yard, unable to look away from the sky. His mind tried to process the implications. This was first contact, but not the way anyone had imagined it. This wasn't a single ship landing on the White House lawn or a delegation arriving with peaceful intentions. This was a show of force so overwhelming that Jake felt his throat tighten with fear. They were here for Zeke. They had to be. What else could bring such a fleet to this exact location? His phone began ringing incessantly. The television inside was probably blaring emergency broadcasts. The world was undoubtedly descending into panic. But Jake couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the alien armada overhead. Some ships were so large that they cast shadows across entire counties, plunging sections of the earth into premature twilight. The sky itself seemed to have been replaced by their presence. Finally, after what might have been minutes or hours, Jake had lost all sense of time. Something changed. One of the larger ships, a sleek vessel that resembled a massive teardrop of metallic blue, descended lower than the others. It stopped perhaps 1,000 feet above Jake's ranch, hovering with impossible precision. A section of its underside opened, and a beam of golden light shot down, not toward Jake, but toward the crater where the smaller ship had crashed the night before. The beam scanned the site for several minutes, moving in precise patterns. Jake could see, even from a distance, that there was nothing left to find. Whatever technology had composed that first ship had completely disintegrated. The scanning beam swept wider, covering his pastures, his barn, and finally began moving toward his house. Panic seized Jake. They were looking for Zeke. They would take the baby, or worse. Who knew what they would do to the human who had interfered with whatever had happened? Jake ran back into the house, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Zeke was awake now, those black eyes watching him with that unnerving intelligence. The baby didn't cry, but Jake sensed distress emanating from the small being. Without thinking, Jake grabbed the infant, still wrapped in that strange color-shifting blanket, and held him close. "I've got you," he whispered, though he had no idea if the baby could understand. "I won't let them hurt you." The golden scanning light swept across the exterior of Jake's house, and then, impossibly, began to penetrate the walls. Jake could see it moving through the rooms, searching methodically. He ducked into his old storm cellar, pulling the heavy wooden door closed above him and descending the stairs into the damp darkness. It was a futile gesture. If they had technology to cross space and field 1,000 ships, a wooden door wouldn't stop them. But he had to try. In the darkness of the cellar, holding the alien baby against his chest, Jake felt Zeke's tiny hand press against his heart. Warmth spread from that point of contact, and suddenly Jake's mind filled with images, not words, but pure meaning, communication beyond language. He saw a ship in distress, fleeing through space from some pursuing danger. He saw desperate parents placing their child in an escape pod, programming it to find the nearest habitable world, sacrificing themselves to save their infant. He saw the pod's rough landing, the beacon that would have called for rescue malfunctioning in the crash. And he saw what Zeke's people had done, mobilized an entire fleet when that beacon finally activated, coming not in anger but in desperate search of their lost child. The vision faded, leaving Jake gasping, tears streaming down his face. They weren't invaders. They were parents, families, a civilization that had moved heaven and earth, literally to find one lost child. And Jake had stumbled into the middle of it. Above him, the golden light had stopped moving, fixed on the location of the storm cellar. They knew exactly where he was, where Zeke was. The question was, what would they do now? Jake looked down at Zeke, who was watching him with those impossibly deep eyes. The baby made a small sound, almost like a purr, and pressed closer. Jake thought about his failing ranch, his lonely existence, his string of failures and disappointments. He thought about how, in one night, his entire understanding of the universe had been shattered and rebuilt. And he thought about how this tiny alien being had trusted him when it had no reason to, had chosen him as protector when it could have rejected human touch entirely. "All right," Jake said quietly. "I'll help. But on one condition, until we figure out what's best for Zeke, he stays with me. No taking him away where I can't see him. No keeping him on your ships. If we're going to do this together, we do it as partners, not as you giving orders and me following them." The being regarded him for a long moment, and Jake felt sure he'd overstepped, that they would simply take Zeke and be done with the troublesome human. But then the being extended what passed for a hand, a gesture Jake recognized from human culture. Agreed. We are called the Elar. I am Counselor Thane. Until a permanent solution is determined, you and the child will remain together. Now, we must act quickly. Your world's military forces are mobilizing, and fear is spreading rapidly. We need to make contact with your leaders before fear turns to violence. Are you prepared for what comes next, Jake Thompson? Jake took the offered hand, feeling energy tingle through his palm. He wasn't prepared, not even close, but he nodded anyway. Let's get started. Above them, the 1,000 ships continued their silent vigil, while on the ground, one poor cowboy holding an alien baby became the unlikely bridge between two civilizations teetering on the edge of either peaceful contact or catastrophic misunderstanding. The diplomatic vessel shuddered as energy weapons struck its shields. Outside, Jake could see the Ilar fleet repositioning, forming a protective sphere around the diplomatic ship. But Thane looked troubled. We cannot fight here. Your world is too fragile. If we engage in full combat above your planet, the collateral damage could devastate your biosphere. We must find another solution, and quickly. Below, Jake could see Earth's military forces scrambling, jets taking off from bases, missile systems tracking the new arrivals. President Chun's voice crackled over the communication system. What the hell is happening up there? Are we under attack? Jake made a decision. Still holding Zeke, he stepped toward the communication panel. Madam President, this is Jake Thompson. The short answer is yes. We're all in danger. But not from the Alar. Those new ships, they're the ones who killed this baby's parents. They're here to finish the job. And if fighting breaks out above Earth, Counselor Thane says the fallout could be catastrophic for everyone on the planet. There was a pause. Then Chun's voice came back, harder, more commander-in-chief than politician. And what do you suggest, Mr. Thompson? Jake looked at Zeke, then at Thane, and an idea formed crazy, almost certainly impossible, but maybe their only chance. The Kresh want the baby, right? They're fixated on eliminating this one child because of what he represents. What if we gave them a reason to leave? Not by giving up Zeke, but by making him irrelevant to their goals? Thane's form brightened with interest. Explain. Jake took a breath. You said the baby's parents were diplomats, that they represented peace. The Kresh see him as a symbol of that movement. But what if we made him a symbol of something bigger? Not just Elar peace, but peace between species, between Earth and the Elar? Make him so publicly valuable, so protected by both civilizations, that attacking him would mean declaring war on two worlds instead of just finishing off one refugee family? Thane considered this, and Jake could sense furious mental calculation happening. You propose making the child a living treaty, an ambassador before he can even speak. The first of his kind, bonded to both Elar and human, protected by laws and customs of both civilizations. It is unprecedented. It would require, he paused, it would require you to accept permanent responsibility for the child's physical care, with Elar support and resources. You would need to learn our medical knowledge, our nutritional requirements, our developmental needs. You would essentially become the first human member of an Elar family unit. And in return, the child would become the physical embodiment of the alliance between our peoples. Another blast struck the shields. More powerful this time. They were running out of time. President Chun's voice cut through. Counselor Thane, our satellites indicate the hostile ships are powering up what looks like significant weaponry. We're tracking what might be nuclear equivalent yields. You need to make a decision now. Thane looked at Jake, really looked at him, seeing past the rough hands and simple life to the core of who Jake was. You would accept this burden? Raising a child not of your species, becoming entangled in our politics and conflicts, giving up any semblance of a normal life? For a baby you found just days ago? Jake thought about his empty ranch, his purposeless existence, the slow decay of everything his family had built. Then he looked down at Zeke, whose tiny hand was wrapped around his finger, whose eyes looked at him with complete trust. I've got nothing to give up. Nothing worth keeping, anyway. But this kid, he deserves a chance. Both our peoples deserve a chance to not screw this up. So yeah, I accept. Whatever it takes. Zeke made a small cooing sound, almost like approval, and warmth spread through Jake's chest again. The baby knew. Somehow, across the gulf of species and development, Zeke understood and agreed. Thane moved with sudden speed, his form brightening to painful intensity. Then we proceed. President Chun, this is Counselor Thane of the LR. I am transmitting a formal proposal for your consideration, and that of the United Nations Security Council. We propose an unprecedented arrangement. The child will remain with Jake Thompson, recognized as guardian by both our civilizations. We will provide all necessary support, medical care, and resources. In exchange, the child becomes a protected entity under both LR and Earth law, making any attack against the child an act of war against both our peoples. We ask for immediate recognition of this arrangement to present a united front against those who would do the child harm. The communication channels exploded with voices, dozens of world leaders speaking at once, advisors shouting, military commanders demanding clarification. But President Chun's voice cut through all of it. Everyone shut up. Counselor Thane, I can't speak for the whole planet, but as far as the United States is concerned, that baby is now under our protection. Any attack on that child is an attack on American soil and will be met with our full military response. Furthermore, I'm invoking emergency provisions to bring this before the UN within the hour. We'll get you your unified protection. Other voices began joining in: the EU President, the Japanese Prime Minister, the African Union Chairperson, one by one, major powers and regional alliances declaring their protection of one alien infant. Outside, the crash ships had been holding position, perhaps confused by the sudden coordination between the Ilar fleet and Earth's forces. Thane broadcast on all frequencies, both those known to the Kresh and those the Ilar had established with Earth. To the Kresh warband, the child you seek is now under the protection of two civilizations. Any hostile action against the child will be met with combined force from both the Ilar Collective and the military forces of Earth. This world has just established formal first contact with our people, and they have chosen to ally themselves with us in this matter. You face not one fleet, but two worlds united in defense of innocence. Withdraw now, or face consequences you cannot overcome. For a long moment, nothing happened. Jake held his breath, clutching Zeke tightly. Then, slowly, the Kresh ships began to retreat, rising back through the atmosphere. A single message came through in the Ilar language, which Thane translated. This is not finished. The child represents a threat to our way of life. We will return, but they were leaving, at least for now. The immediate crisis was over. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Around him, the tension in the ship eased slightly, though everyone knew this was just the beginning of something much larger. He'd just adopted an alien baby and turned his failing ranch into ground zero for interspecies relations. His life would never be simple again, but as Zeke looked up at him with those trusting eyes, Jake realized he was okay with that. For the first time in years, he had a purpose that mattered beyond himself. Jake had thought about little else since the confrontation. I've been scared every day since I found him. But I'm not giving him up. The Ilar could take him back to their worlds, hide him somewhere in space where the Kresh might never find him. But that would mean breaking the bond we formed, traumatizing him all over again. And it would mean the first major interaction between Earth and an alien species would end, with us handing over a refugee child to save our own skins. What kind of message does that send about who we are as a species? Chun smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her political face into something warmer. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need right now. You're an unlikely diplomat, Mr. Thompson, but you might be exactly what both our peoples need. As the weeks turned into months, a routine established itself. Zeke grew quickly. Alar development was accelerated compared to humans, and his personality began emerging. He was curious about everything, his large eyes tracking movement and his hands reaching for objects with increasing coordination. He laughed, a sound like musical chimes that Jake found himself living for. The baby showed preferences. He liked being outside in the morning when the sun was gentle, enjoyed the sound of wind through the grass, and was fascinated by Jake's horse Dakota, who had overcome her initial fear and now nuzzled Zeke gently whenever they were near. But there were challenges too. Zeke had nightmares, waking screaming with terror that Jake felt as waves of raw emotion, memories of the crash, of losing his parents, of those first terrifying moments of abandonment. Jake would hold him during those episodes, rocking him and singing old country songs his own mother had sung to him, and slowly the baby would calm. The Alar specialists said this was a healthy processing of trauma, but it broke Jake's heart every time. The Alar presence on Earth expanded carefully. Small delegations visited major cities, meeting with leaders and scientists, beginning the complex process of cultural exchange. Trade discussions started tentatively. The Alar had technologies that could revolutionize human civilization, but Thane insisted on proceeding slowly to avoid disrupting Earth's development too rapidly. We have seen other species destroy themselves with technology they were not culturally ready to possess, he explained to Jake during one of his regular visits. We will share what helps, but wisdom must develop alongside capability. Jake found himself consulted on these matters, his opinion sought because he'd become the human who knew the Alar best. It was surreal. A year ago, he'd been barely surviving on a failing ranch, and now he was video conferencing with world leaders about interspecies trade agreements. But he tried to stay grounded, to remember that his primary responsibility was to Zeke, not to politics or diplomacy. 6 months after first contact, Zeke spoke his first word. It wasn't in Alar or English, it was something in between, a sound that combined elements of both languages, clearly meaning Jake. The Alar specialists were astonished. He's creating a hybrid language, Cyrus explained, her form pulsing with excitement, drawing from both his genetic heritage and his environment. This has never been documented. A child synthesizing two completely different linguistic frameworks into something new. He is truly a bridge between our peoples. But the peaceful routine was shattered one morning when alarms blared across the compound. Jake was feeding Zeke breakfast, a specially prepared mixture that looked like oatmeal but smelled like cinnamon and starlight, when Thane materialized in his kitchen, his form flickering with distress. They are coming. The Kresh have gathered a larger force and are approaching Earth. They have decided that the alliance between your people and ours is a greater threat than they initially calculated. They intend to eliminate that threat by destroying its symbol, the child. Jake felt ice flood his veins. How long do we have? Thane's form stabilized, taking on the determined glow Jake had learned to associate with resolve. Hours at most. They will arrive in force, and this time they will not be deterred by shows of strength. They intend to fight, regardless of cost. He paused, and Jake could sense the weight of what was coming. We must prepare for war, Jake. A war fought in the skies above your world, with your planet caught in the middle. Unless, he stopped, seeming reluctant to continue. Unless what? Jake demanded, pulling Zeke close protectively. Thane's eyes met his. Unless we leave. Take the child and flee. Draw the Kresh away from Earth. Your people would be safe, but you would lose Zeke, and he would lose you. The bond would be broken, the trauma inevitable, but Earth would survive unscathed. Jake felt the weight of impossible choice settling on his shoulders. Save one child or save one world. The fate of billions of humans balanced against the well-being of one alien infant who trusted him completely. He looked down at Zeke, who was watching him with those depthless eyes, and saw understanding there. The baby somehow knew what was being discussed, knew that terrible decisions were being made. And as Jake held that gaze, he realized there had to be another way. There had to be a solution that didn't require choosing between love and duty, between one life and billions. He just had to find it, and he had less than hours to do so. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. Fight the crash above Earth and risk planetary devastation. Flee with Zeke and break the bond that had become the foundation of everything. Surrender Zeke and destroy the fragile trust between humanity and the LR. Every option led to tragedy. But as he held Zeke, feeling the baby's rapid heartbeat against his chest, a memory surfaced, something Counselor Thane had said weeks ago during one of their long conversations about ELR history. "Thane," Jake said urgently, "you told me the crash broke away from your people because they refused to abandon your ancestral conflicts. They see peace as betrayal, diplomacy as weakness. But you also said your people spent centuries developing biological technology, creating ships that are partially alive. What if," he paused, the idea crystallizing, "what if we could talk to them? Not with words, but with something deeper. Show them what they're actually fighting against?" Thane's form flickered with confusion. "I do not understand. The Kresh have rejected all diplomatic overtures for generations. They communicate only through violence." Jake shook his head. "Because talking doesn't work when both sides are using words as weapons. But Zeke doesn't use words. He communicates through emotions, through direct transfer of meaning. What if we could scale that up? Create a bridge not between two people, but between two philosophies?" Ceris materialized beside Thane, having been summoned by the urgency and the mental link all Ilar shared. "You are suggesting a communion link," she said slowly, her green luminescence brightening with understanding. "A telepathic network that would allow direct experience sharing on a massive scale. It is theoretically possible. We use smaller versions for education and knowledge transfer, but nothing like what you are proposing has ever been attempted. The risks are enormous." "What kind of risks?" Jake demanded. The LR specialists exchanged what passed for nervous glances among energy beings. Thane spoke carefully. "A communion link of that magnitude would require an anchor point, someone to serve as the central hub through which all experiences flow. That person would need to maintain their sense of self while simultaneously experiencing the thoughts and emotions of thousands, perhaps millions of minds. The psychological strain could be catastrophic. Most beings would be destroyed by such an influx, their identity dissolving into the collective. And if the anchor fails, everyone connected could be harmed." Jake understood what they weren't saying directly. You need someone to volunteer to be that anchor. Someone who could potentially die or lose themselves completely in the process. He looked down at Zeke, who was watching him with ancient wisdom in those young eyes. "It should be me. I'm already connected to Zeke. He's been communicating with me since the first night. If anyone has a chance of surviving as an anchor, it's someone who's already learned to accept alien thoughts in their mind." "President." Chen's voice crackled over the communication system. She'd been monitoring everything from the White House Situation Room. "Mr. Thompson, you can't be serious. You read talking about sacrificing yourself on a wild hope that direct telepathy will somehow convince genocidal militants to change their minds. The odds are astronomical." Jake smiled grimly. "Madam President, the odds of me finding an alien baby in a crashed spaceship were astronomical. The odds of first contact going peacefully were astronomical. The odds of that baby forming a bond with a broke Texas rancher were astronomical. I'm running on astronomical odds here. One more won't make much difference." Thane's form pulsed with what Jake had learned to recognize as respect. "If you are truly willing, we would need to prepare quickly. The crash fleet will arrive within 2 hours. We would need to establish the communion link before they begin their attack. Catch them in it before they can raise their mental defenses. It will require coordination between my people and your world's communication networks, broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. And it will require you to open your mind completely, holding nothing back, allowing your experiences with Zeke to flow through you to everyone connected. Jake had already made his decision, but he needed to do one thing first. He carried Zeke outside to the porch, sitting in the old rocking chair his grandfather had made. The baby settled contentedly in his lap, and Jake spoke to him quietly, even though he knew Zeke communicated in ways beyond words. I don't know if I'm coming back from this, little guy, but I need you to understand something. Whatever happens, you're worth it. This whole damn planet is worth it. And maybe, just maybe, I can show those Kresh warriors what I see when I look at you. Not a symbol or a threat, but just a kid who deserves a chance to grow up. Zeke's tiny hand pressed against Jake's chest, over his heart, and warmth flooded through him. Images filled his mind, not memories this time, but something like predictions or possibilities. Jake saw a future where Zeke grew up, where human and Alar children played together, where the art and music and ideas of two civilizations blended into something neither could have created alone. He saw Zeke as an adult, tall and luminous, standing between worlds as a translator and bridge builder. And he saw himself, older and weathered, still there beside the grown Zeke, still protecting and guiding. It was a vision of hope, of potential, of what could be if they survived this day. The preparations happened with frantic speed. Alar technicians set up equipment across the compound, creating a network of devices that hummed with building power. They attached sensors to Jake's temples and chest, monitoring his vital signs as they prepared to channel an unprecedented amount of psychic energy through one human mind. Suris administered something she called a neural stabilizer, an injection that would help Jake's brain handle the strain, though she admitted they had no data on how effective it would be for humans. Military forces around the world went to full alert. Earth space-capable weapon systems, still primitive compared to Alar technology, were brought online. The Alar fleet repositioned into a defensive formation, but Thane had given them orders not to fire unless the communion link failed completely. Everything depended on Jake's ability to hold thousands of minds together long enough to share one simple truth. The Kresh fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel exactly on schedule, appearing as dark shapes against the starfield, weapons already charging. There were more than before easily 200 ships, ranging from small fighters to massive dreadnoughts bristling with destructive capability. They moved with practiced precision toward Earth, clearly intent on overwhelming the defenses through sheer force. Jake could see them on the monitors, and his stomach churned with fear. These were people who had spent lifetimes convinced that violence was the only answer. How could he possibly change minds that hardened? It is time, Thane said quietly. Jake nodded, settling into the chair they'd positioned at the center of the equipment array. Zeke was in a protective pod nearby, safe but visible, his eyes watching Jake. Remember, Suris instructed, do not try to control the flow of information. Let it move through you. Your job is simply to remain yourself while serving as the conduit. Focus on your connection to Zeke. Let that be your anchor to identity. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the equipment activate. At first, there was nothing but a gentle tingling, like electricity dancing across his skin. Then, suddenly, it was as if a dam had burst in his mind. Consciousness flooded in thousands of minds, touching his simultaneously. He felt Alar scientists on distant worlds, human children watching news reports, military personnel manning weapon systems, farmers in rural China, elderly Alar remembering their own lost children, Kresh warriors convinced they were fighting for survival. The sheer volume of thought and emotion threatened to drown him, to dissolve Jake Thompson into a formless ocean of collective consciousness. But he focused on Zeke, on that first moment in the crashed ship when he heard a baby crying and decided to help. He held on to that feeling, the simple, uncomplicated desire to protect an innocent life. And he pushed that memory outward, letting it flow through the communion link to every connected mind. They experienced what he'd experienced, the fear of the unknown, that decision to act, despite that fear, the moment when Zeke's tiny hand had wrapped around his finger, and trust had been established between two beings who should have been impossibilities to each other. Jake felt the Crush warriors in the link, felt their resistance, their anger, their centuries of cultivated hatred for everything the Ilar peace movement represented. But he also felt something else, underneath the indoctrination and the violence. He felt their fear. They were afraid of becoming weak, of losing their identity, of a universe where their warrior culture had no place. They had convinced themselves that aggression was strength, and that the Ilar, who chose peace, had betrayed their heritage. So Jake showed them strength of a different kind. He showed them the strength it took to care for a baby through sleepless nights, to learn an entirely new way of being, to open himself to the vulnerability of love. He showed them human history, the wars and violence, yes, but also the art and music, the exploration and discovery, the slow, painful progress toward becoming better than their worst impulses. He showed them Ilar history through Thane's memories, millennia of development, of choosing to grow beyond their own capacity for destruction, of building civilizations instead of tearing them down. And he showed them Zeke. Every connected mind experienced what Jake experienced daily, the child's curiosity, his joy at simple pleasures, his nightmares about losing his parents, his capacity for trust despite trauma. They felt what it meant to be responsible for a life completely dependent on your care, to make decisions knowing that failure meant the death of someone innocent. The strain was enormous. Jake could feel his body struggling, heart racing, neurons firing in patterns they'd never been designed for. He tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. His vision, even with eyes closed, was fragmenting into a kaleidoscope of perspectives. He was simultaneously Jake Thompson on his ranch, a crash commander on a warship bridge, an Ilar mother remembering her own children, a human teenager watching events unfold on a screen. He was everyone and no one, holding on to his identity by the thinnest thread, anchored only by Zeke's presence. Time lost meaning. It might have been seconds or hours when Jake felt something shift. In the communion link, he sensed the Crush warriors experiencing something they'd suppressed for generations. Doubt. Not doubt about their strength or capability, but doubt about their purpose. They were seeing for the first time in a way that couldn't be denied or filtered through propaganda, that the Ilar they'd spent lifetimes opposing weren't weak or cowardly. They had simply chosen a different kind of strength, one that built instead of destroyed. One Crush mind stood out from the others, the fleet commander, an ancient warrior who had led countless battles. Jake felt the being's internal struggle, felt centuries of conviction warring with a new understanding. And then, in a moment that rippled through the entire communion link, that commander made a choice. The Crush fleet's weapons powered down. Their aggressive formation dissolved into something more neutral. And a message came through, broadcast on all frequencies, the commander's voice carrying weight and authority. We came to eliminate a symbol of what we believed was weakness. Instead, we have experienced something we did not expect. We have felt what it means to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than eliminate. This changes nothing of our history, erases none of our convictions, but it gives us doubt. Doubt is a seed from which new understanding can grow. We withdraw, not in defeat, but in uncertainty. Perhaps there is strength in the path the Ilar have chosen. Perhaps there is warrior honor in protecting life rather than ending it. We require time to contemplate what we have experienced. The Crush fleet turned, and one by one, the ships entered faster than light travel, vanishing back into the depths of space. They weren't converted to peace, not transformed into different beings, but they were changed enough to to question, to consider alternatives to violence. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The communion link collapsed, and Jake gasped as the influx of foreign consciousness cut off abruptly. He opened his eyes to find himself on the ground. When had he fallen? With Ilar and human medical personnel surrounding him. Cerise was performing scans, her green form flickering with concern. His neural activity is stabilizing, she reported. He survived. By all calculations, he should not have, but he survived. Jake tried to sit up, and gentle hands, both human and energy-based, helped him. President Chun was there in person now, having arrived by helicopter during the communion. Thane stood nearby, his form brighter than Jake had ever seen it. And in his protective pod, Zeke was reaching toward Jake, making small distressed sounds. Jake crawled to the pod, ignoring the protests of medical staff, and lifted the baby out. Zeke immediately calmed, pressing close, his skin patterns shifting to show relief and joy. "You did it," Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. "You stopped a war without a single shot fired. You showed them something they couldn't ignore or deny. You gave both our species a chance at a future neither of us would have had otherwise." Jake shook his head weakly. "I didn't do it alone. Every person who was in that link, who shared their experiences and feelings, who opened themselves to connection, they did it too. I was just the ... the wire that connected everyone." Thane knelt beside Jake, a gesture of profound respect among the Alar. "You were more than a conduit. You held firm when any other being would have fragmented. You proved that humans have a capacity for empathy and sacrifice that makes you worthy partners in the cosmos. And you saved not just Zeke, but potentially millions of lives on both sides of a conflict that might have consumed years and worlds." In the days that followed, as Jake recovered from the neural strain, the world processed what had happened. The communion link had been experienced by anyone who had been connected to electronic communication systems during those crucial minutes billions of humans. And Ilar had touched minds, if only briefly. It had been disorienting, frightening for many, but also transformative. People had experienced what it was like to be someone else, to see through alien eyes, to feel emotions that transcended species. It was impossible to hate something you'd been, even for just a moment. The Interspecies Protection Accord was expanded and refined, becoming the foundation for what eventually grew into the Galactic Cooperative, an organization dedicated to peaceful coexistence and mutual growth among sentient species. Jake remained Zeke's guardian, but now with the full support and resources of two civilizations working together. His ranch became more than just a home, it became a symbol, a place where the impossible had become real, where one ordinary person's compassion had changed the course of history. Zeke grew up straddling two worlds, learning both human and Ilar customs, speaking a hybrid language that others began to adopt as the standard for interspecies communication. He was brilliant, curious, and kind of living embodiment of what cooperation between different peoples could achieve. And Jake was there for all of it, no longer a poor cowboy barely surviving, but a father to a child who represented hope itself, a bridge builder who'd proven that love could be a greater force than fear. Years later, when asked what had made him decide to save that alien baby in the crashed ship, Jake's answer was simple. "I heard a baby crying, and I couldn't walk away." Everything else, the politics, the treaties, the grand destiny stuff, that all came later. In that moment, it was just about doing what was right for a kid who needed help. Turns out, sometimes the smallest decisions can change everything. And in the end, that was the lesson both humanity and the Alar took forward into their shared future. That compassion for the vulnerable, that willingness to act despite fear, that simple choice to help rather than ignore, could be the foundation upon which entire civilizations built their greatest achievements. Jake Thompson had been a poor cowboy who rescued an alien baby, and in doing so, he'd rescued the future itself.